Good morning, students. I will wait for a minute for the other students to join the session. Mark all the groups of yesterday we had discussed some of the basics of the pathogenicity, okay, as well as disease and some of the affixes used in the medical terms. And today, basically moving forward with another concepts, okay, of which one of them is a infection, of which one of them is an infection. Okay, so what is an infection? What are the carriers of the infection? What do you mean by reservoirs? Okay, uh, and all these points will be discussed today. Will be discussed in today's lecture. And good morning again to all the students. Okay, I'm going to start the lecture. Now, the infection. Okay, infection is simply a successful colonization of a host by a microorganism. Infection is a successful colonization of a host by microorganism. And these infections can also lead to disease, which causes signs and symptoms resulting in the deviation from the normal structure or the functioning of the bodies. Okay, so basically infection is simply a successful colonization, okay, of a host by a microorganism, where the microorganism will be a parasite, or it may be also termed as pathogen. Okay, and the microorganisms that cause disease are known as pathogens. So what are uh, basically infections? And there are also some other terminologies for the infections which are being used. Okay, and the terms which are also used is the presence of microbes in the body. Okay, and another one, and together with the infection, which is also used, the symptoms of a disease. Okay, and as the infection may have more than one meaning also. Okay, similarly, when we were studying symbiotic association of rhizobium with the plant, in that case also infection is used. Okay, in that case also infection word is used. Okay, but the meaning there is completely different, which we are studying now. Okay, in this case a colonization occurs, but the colonization of the pathogen in the host body will be harmful to the host. Okay, but in the scenario where a beneficial mutualism is present, okay, in that case both host, okay, both host and the rhizobium both are benefited. And the symptoms of the disease may be by two main mechanisms, one by production of toxins, okay, both it may be endotoxin or it may be exotoxin also, and also the production of inflammation occurs. Okay, inflammation also occurs in the human body. So simply, when can we say that a disease is an infectious disease? Okay, what are the parameters when we study medical microbiology? Okay, what are the basics? It basically covers four main points. First point, that the parasite should enter the body. Okay, the parasite should enter the body. Okay, second term, second main point is it must metabolize and multiply on or in the host. The third point, it must resist host defenses. The fourth point, it must damage the host. Okay, these are the main 4 points of a infectious disease. Okay, the first point, for example, salmonella. Okay, for example, salmonella. And to be specific, salmonella typhi, it will be only caused infectious disease only when it enters the host. Okay, or another scenario where there is a skin infection, but it will not enter in the body, but in that case it is going to survive on the surface of the host also. Okay, in the surface of the host also. Okay, whereas salmonella needs to enter the body, in the body, especially in the digestive system, whereas in the case of skin infections, where a fungi, okay, does not need to enter the body for the skin infections, it colonizes on the skin itself. Okay, so the second point comes here, when they enter the body, after entering the body, they must multiply. Okay, they must multiply and must be able to metabolize also. And what are they going to metabolize? They are going to metabolize various nutrients from the host body, and also grow in the host cell or a tissues. Same is in the scenario of a salmonella, and also in the case of a fungi, okay, which produces a which infects our human skin. Okay, the next term is third one is basically it must resist host defenses. Host may have a variety of host defenses, okay, especially in the part of their immune system. Okay, for example, it must be able to avoid phagocytosis, or it may have some other mechanism to avoid to various to defend against immune system, whatever it may be. Okay, so it must basically resist host defenses, but it may not resist all of them. Okay, but at least resist few of the host defense mechanisms. Okay, the last point, it must damage the host. Okay, there needs to be a harmful association. Okay, in which the host is harmed. Okay, so these are the points which are to be taken in the are to be kept in a mind. Okay, in the case of a pathogenicity of a disease, and more particularly to be specific in the case of a infection. Okay, so what are the other points? There are also various types of infections also. Okay, so there are other mechanisms how they are going to enter the body. Okay, there are also various terms which are used. Okay, so moving forward, which are the other points of the infection, or basically a types of infections? Okay, the types of infection, the first one is an acute one. The term is acute infection. Okay, it has a short and relatively severe course. Okay, it is a very short infection. Okay, time being is very short, but has a severe effects on the host and have a severe effects on the host. Okay, one of the example is of streptococcal pharyngitis. Okay, in which sore throat is caused by streptococcus pyogenes. Okay, so it is of a very short duration and have a severe effects on the host. Okay, now the second one is a chronic one. Okay, it's an often chronic one. The chronic infection are basically have a very long period. Okay, a long duration. Okay, in that case pathogen can survive in the body, human body, for a very longer periods. Okay, and thereby affecting the host's health, thereby affecting the host's health. And one of the example is a of a tuberculosis. Okay, which may stay in human bodies for about year, 6 months to years time. Okay, if not given treatment on time, okay, it may also lead to the death of a host. Okay, next one is a fulminating. Next one is a fulminating infections. Okay, fulminating. What do you mean by fulminating infections? These infections are those basically which occur suddenly. Okay, which occur suddenly with a severe intensity. Okay, which occur immediately with a severe intensity. Okay, and the word is also used for fulminating when the disease develops immediately. Okay, immediately, more particularly suddenly. A specific word is suddenly. Okay, and the severely also, and severely. Okay, now the next one, the localized infections. Okay, an infection, sorry, I forgot about the example. Example of a fulminating infection is a cerebrospinal meningitis. Cerebrospinal meningitis caused by Neisseria meningitidis. Caused by the Neisseria meningitidis. And the next one is localized one, a area of a infection which is restricted to a limited area. Okay, for example, a urinary tract infection which is caused by Escherichia coli. Okay, which is caused by a Escherichia coli. Okay, a part, for example, which is basically limited to a particular point only. Okay, now the next one, which is a generalized infection, Okay, generalized infection, in that case it affects many or all the parts of the body, many or all the part of the body. Okay, simply the infection may spread through all over the body, or as well as it may involve more than one organ systems of the body. Okay, in that case the word generalized is used. Okay, the examples are blood infections. Okay, because as the blood travels throughout the body, and also one such example is of a typhoid fever, Now the next one, mixed or polymicrobial infections. Mixed or polymicrobial infections, where in this case more than one microorganisms are involved in a infection. Okay, there are many examples of this type of infections. Okay, where more than one kind of microorganisms contributes to the infections. At a time of an infection, it may be more than one. Okay, example given here is of a gaseous gangrene in which combination of Clostridium species may also occur. Okay, now the next term is primary infection. Next term is primary infection. An initial localized infection that decreases resistance and thus paves the way for a further invasion by the same microorganism or other organisms. Okay, for example, if you are suffering if you are suffering uh, from a disease, okay, in that case your immunity has been lowered, okay, and due to which you are susceptible to now a variety of other pathogens. Okay, so that case in that case you are prone to other infections also. Okay, for example, let's take an example. Mansi is having an infection. Okay, and the infection basically lowers the immunity of the Mansi. Now she is more susceptible for the other pathogens also, but the first infection which she is introduced is called as primary infection, which is going to lower the immunity level of the Mansi. Okay, an example is of a viral influenza, Now the secondary term infection, it's simply an infection which occurs after the primary infection. Okay, and in the primary infection only when the resistance has been decreased. Okay, when the immunity has been decreased. Okay, and the second infection which comes is called as secondary infection. Example is of a pneumococcal pneumonia following the viral influenza. Okay, now this next one. Okay, the infections which we studied right now were some of the main types. Now these are all the subtypes. Okay, starting with the reinfection. For example, a Mansi is been infected by the malaria. Okay, is being infected by the malaria. Now after about a month, okay, she has stopped taking medications. Now due to some of the other reason, her immunity may be lowered. In that case, sometimes malaria, the disease may also develop in the Mansi again. Okay, so in this case, reinfection occurs of the same organism. of the same organism. For example, another example is of a typhoid. Okay, where for example Janissa gets in typhoid, and the doctor has prescribed her medicine for about a 1 month, but instead of taking for a 1 month, Janissa decides that I will take the medicines only for 15 days, and due to which symptoms basically decreases. Okay, but still after the 15 days the salmonella may be still present in her body, due to which after about a month she again may develop a typhoid. Okay, these are the examples of the reinfection. Next one is inapparent or subclinical infection. Okay, an infection that does not cause or produce any detectable manifestation, okay, is known as inapparent or subclinical infections. Okay, for example, Gautam Mehta is having a disease. Okay, he is having an infection, but the signs cannot be easily identified, and symptoms are also not particularly been identified by the Gautam himself. Okay, in that case, word inapparent or subclinical infection is used. Okay, now next comes the latent infection. Next comes the latent infection. Following the infection, some pathogens may remain dormant, okay, or latent form in the host tissues. In the host tissues, when the host mic resistance is lowered, they multiply and produce clinical disease. Such an infection is called a latent infection. Okay, now some of you may be having a doubt regarding, sir, what is the difference between reinfection and latent infection? Okay, reinfection occurs within a very short period of time of the first infection. Okay, very short period of time, for about a month, 15 days, or maximum let's say 2 months. Okay, but in the case of latent infection, it may occur after years also. Okay, it may occur after years also, where pathogen is still present in the body. Okay, and when the host immunity is lowered, it may again infect the host. Okay, such a cases are found especially if in the case of a tuberculosis treatment, if the treatment is not being completed properly. Okay, now the next term is cross infection. The next term is cross infection. When a new infection from patient or a healthy staff carrier is set up an already diseased person, it is called a cross infection. It is called as crossed infection. Okay, simply a new infection from a patient or a healthy staff carrier is set up in a already diseased person. Okay, simply it is crossed. Okay, in that case the word cross infection is used. Okay, so new infection from a patient or a healthy staff carrier. Now next one, the hospital acquired or nosocomial infections. Hospital acquired or nosocomial infections. The cross infections acquired in the hospitals are called as nosocomial infections. Okay. Now moving forward with the atypical infection. infection where the typical or characteristic clinical manifestations, especially for example signs and symptoms of a disease are lacking, is called as atypical infection, is called as atypical infections. For example, uh, let's take an example of a salmonella again, okay, which is the best example. Manisha is having a typhoid, but doctor are not able to diagnose with the help of signs and the symptoms. Okay, why? Because one of the characteristic feature of a typhoid fever is a step fever, is a step fever. Okay, and what happens in the step fever? A fever rises in the body in a step by step manner. For example, a fever rises and maintains its temperature, okay, for a some time, and again increases its temperature, and again maintains the temperature, and again increases temperature. So step by step a fever is basically temperature of the body is being raised. It is a typical feature of a typhoid, okay, but these signs and symptoms are not observed, okay. So in that case it may be also termed as atypical infections. Similarly, the typical or the characteristic manifestations of the disease have been documented, okay, have been documented in the various journals or books, etc., whatever it may be, okay. So a atypical means simply the given person has an infection of a salmonella typhi, has an infection of a salmonella typhi, but the problem is the individual is not showing the typical symptoms of the salmonella typhi, okay. And the next one is fungal infection, and the next one is fungal infection, okay, a condition in which an infection at a localized sites produces a general effect in the body, a general in the effect in the body called focal infection, called focal infection. So simply it's a condition, okay. You may have a infection at a particular single site of a body, okay, but the effect has on your whole overall body in the case of a focal infection, in the case of a focal infection, okay. So there are some also various other examples, okay, of the various other infections also. Now the next ones are iatrogenic or physician induced infections. Iatrogenic or physician induced infections, the infections that results from a unsterilized instrumentation or due to the drug therapy or handling of an infective specimen or the diagnostic procedure by the laboratory staff, okay. So the this basically occurs, okay, iatrogenic or physical induced, it may be due to the negligence of the hospital staff, okay, it may be due to the negligence of the hospital staff. For example, it may be doctor, or during the operations, okay, due to the use of non-sterilized instrumentations, as well as while taking a sample by the laboratory technicians also. If your hand is not proper sanitized okay, then your skin flora, and then your skin flora may also enter your blood, okay. Now the next one is basically auto-infection. Next one is auto-infection. An infection that occurs between two sides, okay, between two sides of the same host. Okay, it's not a pure term, but occurs in a same sites. Now the master infection. An infection is known to occur, but the infection agent cannot be demonstrated. Okay, we know there is some type of infection, but we are not able to or we are not able to demonstrate the pathogen. Okay, we are not able to demonstrate the pathogen. Okay, next comes the opportunistic infection. Next comes the opportunistic infections. An infection with organisms which are normally harmless but become pathogenic when the body defense mechanisms are compromised, when the body defense mechanisms are pathogenized. Okay, so it's similar to that of a opportunistic pathogen. Okay, but the word here used will be an infection, will be an infection. Now the further examples are patient infection. Patient infection, an infection in which the infectious agent can be demonstrated in the discharges of the patient. Okay, where can where we can easily detect the pathogen from the samples of the patient infection. Okay, is called as patient infection. Now next comes the word superinfection. Next comes the word superinfection. A infection, a second infection occurring in an animal which is already experiencing an infection within another agent. Okay, similar to that of a secondary infection. Similar to that of a secondary infection. Now comes the third one, the terminal infection, an acute infection occurring near the end of a disease and often causing a death. Okay, for example, if you already have an infection and then acute infection occurs, okay, and also this may lead to death also. Okay, now the word contagious infection. Now the word contagious infection, the transmissible are also called contagious infection, and an infection basically capable of being transmitted from one animal to the another or one human being to the another human being. Okay, one human being to the another human being, okay, is called as contagious infection. Okay, and a variety of them. Now please have a look of a diagram. Okay, some of the photograph diagrams have been given for a types of the infection. Okay, localized infection, systemic infection, as it spreads throughout the body, focal infection, mixed infection, primary infection and secondary infection also. Examples are given here. Now the next one, a carriers. What are the carriers? Okay, a person who harbors a pathogenic organism without suffering from a disease is called a carrier. For example, a person a person is a carrier is a carrier for a virus. Okay, is a carrier for a virus or he may be carrier for a pathogenic bacteria. Okay, but he will not experience any signs nor the symptoms of that pathogen. Okay, of that pathogen. Okay, but still he may be able to transmit this pathogen to the another persons as well, to the another persons as well. So the person simply who harbors the pathogenic organisms without suffering from any disease is called a carrier. Usually in these cases, person himself or herself does not know that he is a carrier. He is a carrier. Okay. Now the types of the carrier: healthy carrier, a carrier who harbors pathogen and never has been suffered from a disease, and never has been suffered from the disease is called a healthy carrier. Next one is a temporary carrier. Next one is a temporary carrier, a carrier in which a carrier state lasts for less than 6 months. A carrier in which the carrier state lasts for less than 6 months. Okay. Now the next one, the chronic carriers. The chronic carriers, a carrier in which the carrier state lasts for an indefinite period for several years or sometimes throughout their life, and sometimes throughout their life also. Okay, are called as chronic carriers. Now further more types of the carrier, which includes paradoxical carriers, a carrier who acquires pathogen from the another carrier. Okay, for example, Gautam is a carrier of a particular pathogen A, and he transmits the pathogen to the another one. Okay, for example, to the M.Sc. Okay, so in that case, M.Sc will be called as a paradoxical carrier. Okay, next comes a contact carrier, a carrier who acquires a pathogen from the patient. A carrier who acquires pathogen from the patient. For example, Charmy is basically in a diseased condition. Okay, and Nidhi visits the Charmy. Okay, to take care of the Charmy. Okay, but what happens in that case? Nidhi acquires pathogen from the Charmy. Okay, but the Nidhi will not show any signs and symptoms of the disease. She will act as a carrier, but she can transmit the disease to the another persons as well. Okay, now comes the convalescent carrier. For example, a Charmy who is having a disease and has been cured, but still the pathogens are present in the body of the Charmy, so she can act as a carrier. In that case the word convalescent carrier is used. A carrier who has recovered from the disease but continues to harbor the pathogen in his or her body. Okay, now please have a look at different type of carriers. Okay, please, I'll give you only half a minute to look at the diagrams. Asymptomatic ones, carriers are also there. Okay, simply going to read out asymptomatic carriers, okay, without the symptoms. Incubation, convalescent and chronic carriers can transmit infection either before or after the period of the symptoms. A passive carrier is a contaminated but not infected. Okay. Now moving to the reservoirs. Now moving towards the reservoirs. Reservoirs of the microbial infections are humans, animals, plants, soil, or inanimate matter in which organisms usually live. Okay, and can cause infections with or without overt clinical manifestations. Okay, and humans are usually common reservoirs of many of the microbial infections, and if animals are involved as a reservoirs, the term zoonotic infections are used. The term zoonotic infections are used. Okay, and zoonotic diseases are those diseases spread from which spread from the animals. Okay, zoonotic diseases are those diseases which spread from the other animals. Okay, now moving forward with the sources of infection, endogenous sources and exogenous sources. Okay, endogenous sources and the exogenous sources. Okay, now moving with the endogenous sources, the source of the infection is basically the normal flora present in the human body. Okay, as we already discussed, in the case of a normal human flora, okay, normal microbial human flora, when the conditions of the body immune immune systems gets lowered, okay, the immune system get lowered. Okay, in that case, some of the bacteria which are opportunistic pathogen can infect the host. Okay, and these bacteria are usually non-pathogenic, but in certain situations become pathogenic and cause infections at various different sites of in the same host. Okay, and the exogenous sources. Now the sources of an infection is from the outside the body. Okay, the sources of the infection is outside the body, and most of the microbial infections are basically of the exogenous type. Okay, are of or the exogenous nature. Okay, now moving with the sources of the infection. Now the some of the examples of exogenous sources are humans, okay, animals, insects, soil, water, etc. And humans are basically the most common sources, but the not the same body, but in which the human who may be carrier or may be having a disease can transmit to the another human being also. Okay, the patient suffering from a active infection can also transmit the disease to the another persons also. Okay, now animals are also important sources of the infection for the humans, and the symptoms, they may be symptomatic as well as asymptomatic animals also, which can basically transmit the infection to the human beings. and the asymptomatic animals acts as a reservoir of human infections, and these are called as reservoir host. And the infections, basically these type of infections, as we have discussed, are also known as zoonotic infections. Okay, the examples of the zoonotic infections include bacterial, example plague, even anthrax, and some of the viral examples are rabies, and fungal infections are dermophytic infections, parasitic ones are toxoplasmosis, okay, hyatid disease, etc. So there are infections, various other, and the examples of some of the insects, okay, and basically it may be mosquitoes, ticks, mites, flies, fleas, lice may also transmit a wide variety of organisms to the human beings. And the disease transmitted by the insects are collectively referred to as, they are also known as arthropod-borne diseases. They are also known as arthropod-borne diseases. And the insects transmitting these pathogens are called vectors. And the insect vectors may transmit the infection in basically in two ways. They may be mechanical vectors, okay, for example it may be insects also, okay, and some of the mechanical vectors also, okay, some of them also may be the biological vectors also. It may also transmit from the soil, okay, if you are playing in a soil, you may get hurt from that also. You may acquire pathogens, food, the food which is spoiled or contaminated also, water which is maybe contaminated and you may drink water, okay, you may also get an infection from such sources, okay. Now some of the examples, okay, the transmitted from the animals, disease transmitted from the animals, okay, I have already given some of the examples. These are another more number of examples. I'm simply going to just read out these examples, okay. Organisms: bacterial, okay, bubonic plague, bovine tuberculosis, anthrax, salmonella, food poisoning. Viral examples are rabies, yellow fever, rickettsia. Okay, you must not have studied rickettsia. They are obligate parasites. Example is of a murine typhus. Okay, if you want to know more about rickettsia, uh, I already completed the rickettsial part in the second year. If you want to view, you can view in the YouTube. Okay, where I have covered rickettsia and chlamydias together. Okay, and the fungal ones are basically Microsporium carines, also known as zoophilic dermatophytes, and protozoa. One example is of an leishmaniasis. Helminthic ones are the hyatid cyst in the echinococcosis. For example, dog worm. Dog worm. Okay. I'm going to end my lecture. Okay. Let's finish one more slide. Let's finish one more slide. Okay. This is transmitted by the insects. This is transmitted by the insects. Uh, Examples of are Yersinia pestis. The disease name is plague. Reservoirs are rodents, especially rats. Insects are rat fleas. And the organisms, next one is Borrelia recurrentis. Relapsing fever. Reservoirs are humans. Insects are lice. Next one is an leishmania. Disease is leishmaniasis. And reservoirs are humans, dogs, and wild canines. And the sandflies, Treponema species, which includes Treponemiasis, humans, armadillos, antelope, cattle, and the insect is radioid bug and tsetse. Next one is in Japanese encephalitis. Okay, this is Japanese encephalitis. Reservoirs are the birds and the insects are culex, Trinio, rhinaceous mosquitoes. Okay, I'm going to end my lecture now. Okay, tomorrow we are going to discuss portals of entry and exit of a disease. Portals of entry and exit of a disease. Okay, please comment present sir for your attendance. Please comment present sir for your attendance. And join the WebEx session.